The Osborne Internet Linked Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, page 199 through 211. Growing up, Greek citizens were taught that it was their patriotic duty to marry and have children. Sons were always preferred, as they would become the next generation of citizens. They would also be able to look after their parents in old age. Daughters could not do this because they were not allowed to inherit money or property of their own. A father could reject a baby if he believed that it wasn't his or if it was disabled. Baby girls were often rejected too. The baby was then left out to die in an exposed area, such as the top of a mountain. Some babies were abandoned because their parents couldn't afford to keep them. In this case, the baby might be adopted and brought up as a slave. 7 days after the birth of a baby, friends and family were invited to a party to celebrate the birth. Sacrifices were made to the gods and the guests brought gifts for the child. The door of the house was decorated with garlands, olive branches for a boy, and wool for a girl. A special ceremony called the Amphidromia was held, and this was usually when the baby was given its name. When children reached the age of 3, they were no longer regarded as infants. In Athens, this stage of the child's life was celebrated at a spring festival in honor of the god Dionysus, called Anthesteria, or Festival of Flowers. The children were presented with small jugs during this festival. Babies were given rattles and dolls, while older children played with spinning tops, yo-yos, and hoops. Richer families even had small-scale furniture such as stools and cots made for their children. To the ancient Greeks, the purpose of education was to bring up good citizens to take part in running the state. Inevitably, this meant school was limited to boys only. Girls stayed at home and usually only learned to read and write if their mothers could teach them. School began at the age of 7, but it was not free, so most boys only received a basic education. Richer boys could stay on until the age of 18. There were 3 types of schools. At the first, the boys were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic by the teacher, called a grammatus. At the secondary school, poetry and music were taught by a teacher called kaharatis. Boys had to learn pieces of poetry by heart, and they were taught musical instruments such as the lyre or the pipe. On the third school, boys were taught dancing and athletics by a man called the Paido tribes. Boys took part in competitive games at a training ground called the gymnasium. The ancient Greeks did not have universities as we do today, but from the 5th century BC, teachers called sophists went from city to city instructing young men in the art of public speaking. In the 4th century BC, philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle set up schools at gymnasia in Athens. Women in ancient Greece led very sheltered lives. Even by the standards of the ancient civilizations, they could take part in politics or own property. Their lives were always under the control of the male relatives, fathers, husbands, brothers, or even sons. A girl usually married when she was only about 15 years old, but her husband could be much older than she was. The philosopher Plato suggested that 30 to 35 was the best age for a man to get married. The husband was chosen by the girl's father, who provided her dowry. This was a gift of money and goods which was looked after by the husband. The day before the wedding, the bride sacrificed her toys to the goddess Artemis and symbolized the end of her childhood. Then she bathed in water from the sacred spring, carried to the bath in a special vase called a lutrophorus. These vases were often decorated with scenes of the wedding ceremony. On the day, both families made sacrifices to the gods and held feasts in separate houses. Then in the evening, the groom went to his bride's home. This was often the first time they had ever met. The couple then made their way back to the groom's house. If they were rich, they were driven by chariot, led by the torchbearers and musicians. Poorer people had to make do with a simple cart. The bride was carried over the threshold as a symbol that she was joining the religious life of this new family. The family scattered fruit or nuts over them for good luck. At home, a woman played a vital role. She managed the finances, food, housework, spinning, and weaving, and cared for the children and for everyone else in the family if they fell ill. In Athens, for rich married women at least, there was very little life outside of the home. They were permitted to visit female friends or to invite them to dinner, but these were women only affairs. They had very few other opportunities to leave the home. One compensation for women from poorer families was that they could get out more. They had to go shopping and collect water from the well, which gave them more of a chance to see life outside of the confines of their home. Some even had jobs as innkeepers. A wife was expected to be devoted to her husband. If he suspected her of being unfaithful, he could divorce her and keep her dowry and the children as well. Not all girls were brought up to be good, obedient wives. Some became companions to rich men. They lived in great comfort and could even attend men's dinner parties. Very few Greek houses have been excavated because they were built of mud brick, which does not last. But we have a good idea of what they were like from the ones that have been found, and because the design of houses in the Mediterranean has changed so little over the centuries. A typical house was built around a courtyard with a door to each room and a few small windows in the outside walls. The walls were made of mud brick or stone foundations with wooden doors and window shutters. There were stone slabs on the floor of the courtyard and mosaics of stone slabs on the floors downstairs on the inside. The roof was covered with clay tiles. The men and women in the wealthy Greek household lived very separate lives in separate parts of a house. Although most houses had a single floor, some had two. The men ate and entertained in a downstairs room called the andron. The kitchen and bathroom were also downstairs, as well as a special room dedicated to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, which was used for family gatherings. In a house like the one here, the family bedrooms, the servants' quarters, and the women's rooms known as the gymnasium were all upstairs. Women from the richer families led very sheltered lives. They spent most of their time confined to their room, organizing the household, spinning, weaving, and talking to other women friends. Greek houses were lit by a small, oil-burning lamp made of pottery, bronze, or even silver. Oil was poured into the round body of the lamp and then lit a wick, a piece of string coated with wax, which was sticking out of the spout. Most houses were very simply furnished with plain wooden tables, chairs, and beds. In richer households, the furniture might be decorated with elaborate patterns, with ivory, gold, or silver inlaid into the wood. Greek clothes were extremely simple in design. Men wore tunics, and women wore a robe called a chiton. Both were made from one or two rectangular pieces of cloth sewn up the sides and fastened at the shoulders with pins and brooches. Tunics were normally knee-length for young men and ankle-length for older men. They were often worn with a belt and hitched up over to keep them in place. When the weather was particularly hot, craftsmen and slaves often wore nothing more than the loincloth tied around their waist to keep them cool. In cold weather, people sometimes wore cloaks as well. A long one was called a himation. A short one was a chalmis. Out in the sun, people often wore shady, wide-brimmed hats. There was two styles of chiton, Doric and Ionic. The Doric chiton was a single piece of cloth folded over at the top and wrapped loosely around the body with a belt and brooch at the shoulder to make armholes. The Ionic chiton was made from two pieces of cloth stitched up the sides and fastened along the shoulders and arms with brooches. Most people's clothes were made of plain wool or linen, although richer people could afford to dye or decorate them. Bright patterned fabrics were popular in the Archaic period. Later, clothes were often one shade, sometimes with a patterned border. Fashion and hairstyles changed over the centuries. As time went on, men's hair and beards grew shorter and tidier, and women's hairstyles became higher and more elaborately styled. Most Greeks went barefoot for much of the time, or wore strappy leather sandals. But they did not have other styles of shoes. They did have other styles of shoes, such as calf-length boots for horsemen. Rich women bathed every day and rubbed themselves with perfumed oils. Powdered chalk was used to make their skin look fashionably pale. They also used a red powder on their cheeks and a darker one for emphasizing their eyebrows. Most people in ancient Greece lived by farming. Although the land wasn't always easy to cultivate, there was good farmland by the coast and in the valleys, but the rest of the country was rugged, rocky, and mountainous, suitable only for grazing mountain sheep and goats. Ancient Greek farms were usually fairly small and only produced enough food to feed one family, with a little extra to sell at the local market. They were worked by the owner, his family, and a few workers or slaves. Citizens from the towns often owned farms too and paid a manager to look after them. Wheat and barley were the most important crops. They were used to make bread and porridge, which formed the major part of the diet, at least for poor people. The grain was sown in October and harvested in April or May. After this, the field was left fallow, unplanted, for a time so that the soil could regain its goodness. Olives and grapes were among the most important crops. Most olives were crushed in a press to make oil, which the ancient Greeks relied on for a great many things: medicines, cosmetics, and lighting, as well as cooking. Grapes were grown for eating or pressed to be made into wine. Farmers kept pigs and poultry for their meat, and the sheep and goats for their milk and hides, too. Cows were not common. Horses were bred in the region of Thessaly. Where there was a lot of good pasture. Oxen and mules were used as working animals on farms. The oxen pulled heavy equipment, and mules pulled carts and carried loads. The ancient Greeks ate many of the same sorts of things that we do. The main difference was that most people ate more porridge and bread than anything else. Greek bread was usually made from barley as it was cheaper than wheat. The Greeks also ate fish, cheese, vegetables, and fruit, but relatively little meat. Apart from wild animals, they could hunt, such as hare, deer, and boars. Coriander, sesame, and honey were often used to add taste, but not sugar, because they didn't have any. At the heart of every Greek city was a main square, or marketplace, called an agora. It was the focus of business life and the hub of local gossip. A meeting place where people gathered to shop, do business, catch up on the latest news, and chat with their friends. Storekeepers often sold their goods in open rooms with a counter across the front. Behind a row of columns in a building in the agora called a stoa, local farmers also set up temporary stalls in the middle of the square. Meat and fish were often displayed on marble slabs, which kept the food cool in the hot sun. Traders in the agora were controlled by different officials. In Athens, 10 metronomai were chosen annually to check weights and measures and to ensure that the customers were not cheated with short measures. Officials called agoranomai checked the quality of the goods. They were specifically in charge of keeping an eye on the grain trade. By the 6th century BC, each city was issuing its own coins, which became a sign of its independence. People who wanted to do business in another city had to change their money with a money changer. These people charged a fee, and they often made such a profit that they lent money too. A money changer sometimes helped people who had money to spare. He would find a suitable venture for them to invest in and pay them interest for the profits. Coins were probably invented at the end of the 7th century BC in Lydia, a kingdom in Asia Minor. They were made of electrum, a mixture of gold and silver. The idea spread to the Greek colonies in Ionia and then to the mainland Greece. Sparta was the only state that didn't adopt coins until later in the 4th century BC.